How do you feel about getting started? I'll do your introduction. Is that good?
Sure, absolutely. We can get going.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody to another presentation from Healthy at Home here at Aging and Adult Services. And today we have a really great topic, one that I'm very interested in selfishly. It's called brain health. What is it? Why does it matter? And what can you do about it? And our presenter today is, I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. Dr. Suchy is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Utah. She is board certified in clinical neuropsychology, which is a subspecialty of psychology that examines normal and abnormal brain functioning. Dr. Suchy's research focuses on changes in cognition and daily functioning that are associated with aging, with the main focus on prolonging functional independence among older adults, which is awesome. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Dr. Suchy. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that very nice introduction. And I'm very excited to have the opportunity to be here and share a little bit about what we do and what cognitive aging and brain health is all about. So let's get started. Let me just tell you first a little bit what we're going to be talking about. So first, we'll just talk about normal cognitive aging. So what is it? Why does it matter? And also to understand why this happens, what causes it. So we'll be talking about things that have to do with the brain. And then we'll move on to talking about what there is that you can do about it. So essentially about brain health, but also I will spend a little bit of time talking beyond the brain. What are some things that matter that are not necessarily related to maybe changes in your brain as a function of age? So let's look at what cognitive aging actually is. So you can see this graph here, and can everybody see my mouse moving? Is this visible when I'm okay, great. So, when you look at aging and changes in cognition, there is this actually line that declines throughout the life. So starting at age 17 and going on from there. So actually throughout our life, things like how fast we process information declines, and even things like memory declines, literally starting at age 17. And we don't necessarily start noticing those changes, even though they're happening, till we're usually about in our 40s or so. And then later in life, around, in your 50s and 60s, you may begin to notice a little more difficulty with reasoning and problem solving. Basically, things take a little longer or aren't as clear to you immediately, or spatial abilities. So that may have to do with maybe finding it more difficult to find your way around, especially in novel places. And then one thing that people for sure complain a lot about is word finding difficulties, name finding difficulties. So, you know a name of somebody, and just when you need to say it, when you're talking to a friend, say, it just doesn't come up and you can't make it happen. And so all of this, even though, people complain about it, they're not happy with it, all of this is part of normal aging. Now, we used to think that the line looked like this, but the last couple of decades or so, we've come to realize that actually there's quite a bit of range of what normal aging looks like. So you have some people, the top green line, who almost don't change at all as a function of age, and some who decline a little more. And so that initial line I showed you is kind of that average type of a person in terms of their decline with aging. So the good news is that regardless where you fall, you're still kind of in that normal range and you're able to function in daily life. Things may get a little more difficult, but you are independent. And it's not till you fall below this red line that you may begin to experience some loss of independent functioning. And so what we're going to talk about today is that you kind of want to do what you can to stay away out of this yellow area and instead to be in the green area. So be as close as possible to that top green line. And in fact, sometimes the people who are on that green line are referred to as super agers. So people who really have kind of excellent brain health and their cognition doesn't decline much. Now, you may say, why should you care? Why should you care whether you're in the green space or in the yellow space? It's still all normal aging and you're still living independently. Well, I would argue that the closer you are to the super ager line, the closer you are to the top of this graph, the better your quality of life. And why is that? Well, we all experience these instances, right? You're looking for your glasses, for example, and they're sitting on your nose, and it's annoying. It's irritating. It makes you waste your time looking for things. Or as we said before, word retrieval. So you may say, oh, I have trouble remembering words like, and then that word just doesn't come to you. You can't retrieve it. And here, just for a little comic relief, one lady comes to the neighbor's house, says, my memory is getting so bad. I can't remember what it is that I'm not supposed to tell you, right? So we make these jokes about things that we all experience in our daily life as we get older. And so the closer, like I said, you are to the top line, the less you'll be experiencing these difficulties. So your quality of life will be better. But another reason, and perhaps even a more important reason, is that by being closer to that super ager line that I was showing you, the better you are at staving off effects of abnormal aging. So what do I mean by abnormal aging? Abnormal aging means that you have some disease in your brain. So disease like, for example, Alzheimer's disease. And that will then begin to impact how your cognition is. So how does that happen? Now imagine if you're close to the super agers and you're going along in your life, you're sticking to that top line, and then some disease happens, say like Alzheimer's disease. If that happens, then what you'll begin to notice is that your cognition begins to decline. But you may live your entire life still being with that normal aging range and not ever actually even knowing that that disease is in your brain. So you would still be able to be above that line of normal functioning. In contrast, if you're closer to the bottom line and you begin to develop some disease in your brain, you again begin to decline, but then you dip beneath that line of independent functioning, and you may experience some loss of independence, and that would be something that we would consider dementia at that point. And so you can see clearly that you are better off keeping your brain as healthy as possible so you can stay within that green space. Another reason to then stay in that green space on that graph is that that will allow you to maintain independence longer, as I just showed you. So let's talk about independence for a little bit. There are different domains of independence. So one domain of independence is referred to as basic activities of daily living. And this really has to do with those basic things we learned early on in our life. And we really take these for granted. Turns out, however, that people as they get older may begin to lose even these basic abilities. So on this graph, for example, you can see that the older people are, so those are the white bars, those are people above the age of 85, the bigger percentage of them begins to lose some of these abilities. So as an example, above the age of 85, in the domain of bathing, as many as 35%, so 1 in 3 people may need some help, may develop some difficulties. However, when you look at the top 10 causes of disability in the United States, and these are these causes, you'll notice that the most common ones have to do with orthopedic issues. So things like arthritis or back problems. And while that is very, very important, of course, this is something for you to work with your rheumatologist or your orthopedic doctor or what have you. And here today, we'll be talking about this fifth cause of disability, so declines in cognition and dementia. And these things are less likely to have an impact on those basic activities of daily living we were just talking about, such as hygiene and dressing and that kind of stuff, are more related to another domain called instrumental activities of daily living. And so this has to do with things that you also begin to develop in childhood, but kind of throughout your early years, you learn how to cook or talk on the phone or manage your money or even drive as you get older. And all this learning early on in your life will bring you to the point of reaching full functional independence. And what that means is that you move away from your parents' home and you just start a life on your own in your own place, right? And that's the full functional independence that we want to maintain. So, I just lost my train of thought, but let me put this graph here. So in order to maintain your functional independence, then longer, right, not to dip below this line, the red line, you want to stay within the normal aging range. But as I already showed you guys before, the closer you are to the superagers, the easier it will for you to not dip below that line, even if you have, for example, some disease in your brain. And so now let's talk about a little bit what causes this decline with age. And by understanding what causes it, you may be able to then look into some ways how you can alter where on this graph you will fall. So let's talk about neurons. I'm sure people here know that neurons are the building blocks of the brain. So they're the brain cells that make up the brain and are responsible for thinking and for information processing and communication among brain cells. So people probably have seen a picture like this before. And we're going to talk about two parts of the neuron. This part up here, these little fingers, they're called dendrites, and they're the part of the cell that receives information from other neurons, from other brain cells. And this bottom part here is called an axon. And this part of the brain is responsible for sending information from the dendrites all the way down to some other brain cell. And so very important for that information to travel. It can travel some distances, like from one side of your brain to the other, so one hemisphere to the other, or the back of the brain to the front of the brain, that kind of stuff. And so why am I telling you about these? Well, it turns out that the dendrites, unfortunately, can shrivel up during prolonged chronic stress. So if you're stressed out a lot, and sometimes, when we go through difficult periods, when we're stressed, we notice that we're not thinking as clearly as we used to. And that's because these dendrites can shrivel up, but the good news is they can grow back once the situation improves. But for a time being, they may not communicate as effectively with other brain cells. And furthermore, these dendrites can sprout out, grow more, get bushier when they are challenged. The other thing we want to know is that the axon, this part of the brain cell, becomes damaged by certain medical conditions. So for example, if you have uncontrolled high blood pressure or high cholesterol or diabetes. So of course, as we get older, many people have these conditions. It's very common, but the idea is that we have medications that can control these. And by controlling these conditions with medication, then you are protecting the axon from becoming further damaged. So basically, what I'm saying is that if you keep your neurons healthy, and we'll talk about how to do that, you'll be closer to the top line or the super agers. Whereas if you don't keep your neurons healthy, then you'll be closer to the bottom line. And these are things, there are things we can do to control this. Okay. So now we'll talk about the most important part of the talk today, which is what is it that you can do about keeping your neurons healthy. And if you don't remember anything, okay, my slides stopped forwarding. Let's see. If you don't remember anything from today's talk, I just want you to remember this basic thing, that what's good for your heart is good for your brain. And many people know what's good for their heart because their physicians talk to them about it frequently. I am sure your internist or cardiologist or just your family doctor. But turns out that all the things that they tell you to do are also good for your brain. So we know that, for example, heart disease is related to things like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, and chronic stress. And as you know, I was just telling you that those are the very same things that can damage or impede normal functioning of those brain cells, of neurons. So as a reminder, right, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, all can damage the axon, and chronic stress can cause these dendrites to shrivel up. So we have some goals then in order to keep our brain and our hearts healthy, which is to control your blood pressure and cholesterol, blood glucose, and manage your stress. And so how do we do that? These are things I'm sure you've heard before, things like exercise and diet, making sure you control your medications properly, and stress reduction. So let's talk about these. Let's start by talking about exercise. And people always ask, well, what exercise to do? Many of you, I'm sure you have heard of aerobic exercise. So this refers to using the same muscle groups repeatedly for about 30 minutes, 5 times a week is the recommendation. But if you use the same muscles for about 10 minutes, that's when your body begins to experience aerobic exercise. And the way you know that you're actually engaging in aerobic exercise is if in about 10 minutes you begin to get a little clammy, a little moist, you just begin to notice that you're not necessarily perspiring profusely, but you're just feeling that little bit of moisture. And this type of exercise does decrease blood pressure, does decrease cholesterol and glucose, and also decreases stress. So all the things we talked about that are bad for your heart and bad for your brain can be improved by aerobic exercise. But there are some other exercises that are helpful. So yoga, while it improves balance and flexibility and therefore keeps you from falling and injuring yourself, it also is great for decreasing stress. Similarly, stretching improves flexibility, decreases risk of injury. But again, and I don't know how many of you do that, but just stretching a muscle suddenly lets that stress kind of melt away. And lastly, strength training. So building muscles through a variety of exercises. It really gives your body the strength to engage in all those other types of exercises. So bottom line is that any and all forms of exercise can help control or improve blood pressure and cholesterol, blood glucose, weight, which is related to those issues, and stress. And the idea is that, sometimes people ask, what's the best exercise to do? And if you tell them, well, aerobic exercise is the best, and they say, but I hate doing that. So I'm here to tell you that any exercise is better than none. And you're better off doing what you enjoy than not doing anything. You're also better off doing less than what's recommended. So even though 5 times a week for 30 minutes is recommended, if you do 10 minutes 5 times a week, it's better than a none. So I just want to encourage you to uh, take this as probably the best advice for um, functioning of any part of your body, uh, including the brain. So here again, we have the top 10 causes of disability. And we already talked about the fact that the really primary causes have to do with orthopedic issues. And turns out that these causes of disability that have nothing to do with the brain are also helped by exercise. So by exercising, you will control or help to improve or diminish the problems related to these orthopedic issues, but you will also improve heart issues and lung issues. We already talked about, obviously, improving cognition, diabetes, risk of stroke. And so you can see that by exercise, you are essentially taking care of all these top 10 causes of disability, with the exception of sensory problems, so hearing loss and blindness. So what's good for your heart is good for your brain. So what were the things we wanted to accomplish? We already talked about exercise. Now let's talk about diet a little bit. Many of you may have heard about the fact that the Mediterranean diet is the healthiest diet really for your heart. And turns out, again, that means it's also good for your brain. Turns out that, for example, in Greece and in Italy, there are fewer deaths from heart disease than in Northern Europe or in North America, including the United States. So there's clear indication that this diet is healthy. And what is it comprised of? Well, healthy fats. I know that, maybe 20 years ago you were told to stay away from fats, and now everybody's telling you, no, some fats are good for you. So yes, those recommendations for low-fat diets have been amended, and you really should be consuming olive oil and nuts and avocado, those types of healthy fats, and staying away from less healthy fats, such as fat on meats, for example, so animal fats. Fruits and vegetables, that's been always there. That, probably throughout your lives, you've heard that fruits and vegetables are good for you. And that certainly continues to be the case in this diet. And whole grains. So trying to stay away from white bread, for example, but eating more, less of those white wheat types of foods. And you don't have to be a vegetarian or vegan to be adhering to Mediterranean diet. So, but what is recommended is that you replace the red meats in your diet with things like fish and poultry and beans, which is not meat, but it's high in protein, and eggs. And again, you may remember, 30 years ago, eggs were the bad guy. We now understand that eggs are actually good for you. They are a good source of cholesterol, but also good source of healthy fats. And a little tidbit, when you go to the grocery store, you may see that there are different types of eggs, right? And some eggs say that they're free-range chickens or kind of natural, more naturally raised chickens. And it may seem like, well, what does that matter? But turns out that actually the eggs from free-range chickens have higher amount of the healthy fats that are consistent with the Mediterranean diet. And those chickens that do not have the opportunity to live in a free-range environment actually produce eggs that are somewhat less healthy. So consider investing into buying those free-range eggs if that fits within your budget. Okay, so back to this idea that what's good for your brain, heart is good for your brain. So what are the other things we want to talk about? medications. I know it's common, actually, it's quite common for older adults to get a little, I don't want to quite say sloppy, but maybe less diligent about how they manage their medications. Sometimes it may seem like, what does it matter if I skip a day? Sometimes people skip because they want to budget their pills because it's cheaper. Um, Sometimes people skip medication because just they make a mistake. They don't quite remember whether they took their medication. But I want to encourage you, especially for that high blood pressure medication, diabetes, cholesterol medication, to really be diligent about taking your meds as prescribed. If you have trouble with um, keeping track of those medications, pill boxes are an excellent way to do it. I'm fully aware that people have all sorts of ways of managing their medications, and not everybody uses a pill box. Um, my mom, for example, has this little cup that she puts all her meds in for the week. So she does make mistake, and I keep trying to talk her into using a pill box so that she wouldn't make those mistakes, but she won't listen to me. But the idea is that it really is important that you don't let that blood pressure to be going up and down, or your blood glucose to be going up and down by skipping the medications on different days. The other thing I wanted to stress to you is to check your blood pressure frequently. It is really easy these days to have a blood pressure monitor at home. They're quite affordable. And the recommendation is that you keep your blood pressure at or below 120/80. Now, you may be aware that for many, many years, physicians used to say, if you're older and your blood pressure is 140/85, it's not that big a deal. Well, recently there was a very large scale study that had thousands and thousands of people in it, where they were basically comparing people whose physicians told them that it was okay to keep their blood pressure at 140/85 or somewhere in that range, with a group of people who, through medications, really kept it down at 120/80. And the results were so striking that the study was stopped not prematurely, but it was stopped early because they felt it was unethical to allow people anymore to keep their blood pressure at higher than 120, at 130, 140. So there was a difference, large difference quickly emerged in terms of people having strokes or heart attacks or even death in that group who had the higher blood pressure. And so if your physician's telling you that 140/85 is fine, maybe you can kind of remind them of this study, but it really makes a big difference to keep it under control as much as possible. Okay, so back to this slide. What's good for your heart is good for your brain. And so we also talked about the importance of stress reduction. So how do you reduce your stress? Many of you are well aware that things like mindfulness meditation are good for stress reduction. And turns out when you look at studies that look at people who engage in mindfulness meditation, not only are they less stressed out, but they also have better cognition in general. But in particular, their attention and also their ability to reason and problem solve is actually better than for people who do not practice mindfulness meditation. And of course, because it decreases stress, it also promotes health heart. And as we already said many, many times today, what's good for your heart is good for your brain. So how do you go about engaging in meditation? Well, some of you may have taken some classes. That gets a little more difficult these days during COVID because maybe you don't want to go to the gym and take a meditation class. Uh, but there are all kinds of apps on smartphones or tablets that you can use. They're actually quite helpful because they may give you reminders every day to engage in meditation. They may keep track of how many minutes each day you meditated. And so they give you all kinds of encouragements and keep you actually meditating, maybe more so even than if you go to an in-person class. And then just reading, there are books about meditation. Reading those books also keeps you motivated and helps you understand why and how meditation is good for you and how to do it properly or most effectively. Okay. You probably have heard this many, many times that sleeping 7 to 8 hours a night is important. It does decrease your stress. You know that if you have a bad night of sleep, you kind of wake up and you're stressed already before even anything happened that day. And again, we know from research that people who sleep longer or who improve their sleeping habits and move from sleeping less well to sleeping better, improve their cognition in general, but memory in particular. And I can't stress enough, if you have concerns about your memory, how important sleep is. Turns out this is not just something that works for older adults. Sleep is what allows your memory to get what we call consolidated. So, for example, if you were to be taking a class and study for an exam, uh, your best bet is to study, but then go to sleep before the exam. Uh, as students, if yourselves ever did the thing that undergraduates sometimes do, stay up all night and study and then take the exam without any sleep, you will actually not do as well. And you may remember that, like, that didn't work that well. But if you even take a little bit of sleep in between studying and then having to recall things, sleep really helps consolidate those memories. And so as we get older and our memory or capacity to learn new things and remember begins to decline, and the sleep becomes more and more important to help us remember. And once again, of course, we know that sleep is good for heart health, which then is good for brain health as well. So, how do you go about sleeping well? There are certain things that are well known to interfere with good night's sleep. So, for example, eating a large meal late at night before going to bed, or alcohol use, especially close to bedtime. But also, these days, we spend a lot of time on our iPads and iPhones, and we know that spending a lot of time on those devices close to bedtime interferes with sleep. And similarly, watching television just before you go to bed, or some people even have a television in their bedroom and kind of have it on all the time and fall asleep while watching TV, and that's how they get themselves to sleep. It may feel like it's easier to go to sleep, but again, it leads to sleep that's of lesser quality and less likely to actually get full 7 to 8 hours because you'll be waking up without realizing it throughout the night. The other things that help quite a bit is the use of sleep masks and earplugs. And I have to tell you, I used to hate earplugs. I would every once in a while I would try that, and they're just horrible, and I couldn't figure out how to keep them in my ears. And I know a lot of people who feel that way too. Well, these days there are these silicone earplugs that are very soft. They mold completely to your ear, and they truly block out all the noise out there. They are amazing, so I want to encourage people to use them, especially couples when there is a second person with you in the bedroom who may be getting up to go to the bathroom or maybe have a little bit of a snoring problem. Common issues. Earplugs go a long way. And then maintaining regular bedtime and wake time. So having a regimen, not changing each night when you go to bed and when you wake up, also is important. Now, sometimes you may be doing all these things and you still don't sleep well. And so that sometimes is a function of needing to go to the bathroom many times during the night. If that's the case for you and it's just really keeping you from getting a good night's sleep, then talk to your doctor. Um, there are medications that can improve that condition. And just in general, for other reasons, if you're unable to get a good at least 6 hours of sleep, even though you want to be shooting for 7, but definitely if you go less than 6, then talk to your doctor about that and see if there are some things that they can do. Other stress reduction strategies include things like healthy coping. Reappraisal and reframing, in particular, is a really healthy emotion regulation strategy that is known to decrease stress, and it improves how you're feeling. So imagine a situation, for example, if you're driving and somebody cuts you off and you get really annoyed and feel kind of affronted and angry. Well, you can go on and feel angry. That's one feeling you have. Or you can reframe, right? And reframing means that you come up with a different explanation for why that happened. Rather than thinking, oh, that person affronted me, you can think, well, maybe that person was taking their child to the hospital, or maybe a pregnant wife who's in labor. And immediately you'll feel that anger to melt away, you'll feel better. And getting good at being able to reappraise or reframe situations that are upsetting to you has been shown repeatedly that it's good for your heart health. People who don't effectively refrain have more heart disease, in fact. So again, developing those skills is really important. In contrast to that, coping strategy that's unhealthy is something that we call expressive suppression. So this means that you kind of deny that you're feeling anything. So somebody cuts you off when you're driving, you're all upset, and maybe your spouse is sitting next to you and says, oh, come on, don't be so upset. And you just say, I'm not upset, I'm not upset. You just kind of deny that you're upset. You try to keep it together, but you're kind of stewing on the inside. And so if that's happening to you, we know that that is actually not good for your heart. It's not good for your brain. It does not decrease, pretending it's not there, does not decrease the emotion. And like I said, increases the stress you're experiencing in daily life. Okay, so now we talked about all these things: exercise, diet, medication, stress reduction. And you're maybe thinking, gosh, I've heard this before. I don't really believe you that this really does anything for my brain. Is there anything else I can do beyond that? And many people think what I want to do is exercise my brain, right? And I'm going to say you that yes, you can exercise your brain, and that's yet another way how you can keep yourself closer to that superager line on that initial graph I was showing you. So remember when we were talking about the nerve cells, neurons, we said that dendrites shrivel up when you're chronically stressed and that axons get damaged by certain medical conditions. But remember, I also said that dendrites sprout up when challenged. So it's that whole notion of use it or lose it. So if you challenge yourself cognitively, you're going to get much bushier dendrites, and your brain's going to communicate. Parts of the brain are going to communicate better with other parts of the brain. So many people, when I say challenge yourself cognitively, think of these things. Okay, I should do Sudoku and play Scrabble and read a lot and do crossword puzzles. And all of that is true, but I'd like to tell you that there is more to it than that. So that brings me to a concept I want to introduce to you, and that's cognitive reserve. So how do we build cognitive reserve? Cognitive reserve is really typically thought of being built through formal and informal education. So, for example, typically the longer you went to school, the more years of education you have, the better your cognitive reserve. But we also know that people who are interested in learning, even if they didn't go to school, even if they didn't graduate from high school, say, can still build that same cognitive reserve through informal means, such as just being interested in things, reading, going to lectures in a local library, watching educational programs on television, or just learning from other people. So both formal and informal education builds that cognitive reserve. And cognitive reserve is what allows you to really stay, it's exactly what it sounds like, right? It's reserve. And so if you're closer to that super age uh, line on the original graph I showed you, then you have all this reserve that even if you begin to decline because of, say, Alzheimer's disease, you still have all this reserve that keeps you from losing the ability to function. So you build your cognitive reserve, but you mainly want to make sure you maintain it throughout your life. So that brings us to that use it or lose it notion that people are very well aware of. So how do we do that after we graduate from high school or from college or what have you? Well, occupation, if you work outside of the home, or volunteer work, for example, are really good ways to maintain cognitive reserve for many reasons. One is that you continue to learn new things as you do it, and you continue to use the skills you have. Similarly, social interactions. The more you talk to other people, the more you have to retrieve names and retrieve words. And so you are kind of counteracting that difficulty with word retrieval that is so common as we get older. Additionally, in social interaction, people bring up things. People bring up topics that you may have not thought about since high school. And suddenly, that part of the brain that was sitting there sort of dormant, that topic becomes kind of activated, and the neurons begin to sprout, the dendrites begin to sprout a little bit. And so you are kind of refreshing old reserves that you of information you've acquired earlier in life. Recreation, similarly, reading, going to theaters, going to museums, traveling, excellent way to maintain and build cognitive reserve. Every time you travel, you'll learn something new. You will be challenging your problem-solving abilities, how to get around in a new town, how to get around in a new airport. So all that is really excellent for maintaining as well as building cognitive reserve. And then those things that most people think about, Sudoku, crossword puzzles, all of those, of course, also play a role, but are not enough on their own. The other thing I wanted to say is kind of the last thing I want to say is don't let the world pass you by. So you learned all these skills, right, early on in your life. And you learned how to go to the store, for example, go shopping. And so your whole life, you use that skill of how to go through the checkout lane, for example. But then these guys appeared suddenly, those self-checkout lanes. And my experience is that most older people just hate them. So what I'm here to do is to encourage you, if you're not using the self-checkouts, to use them. Why is that? Because it will grow a reserve of new skills. You now will be again working on building and maintaining that cognitive reserve. But even more importantly, you will never be as young again as you are today, right now. You will never be as young as you are right now. And so if you're having a little bit of a trouble learning how to use these self-checkout lanes, imagine 10 years from now, it's going to get harder. And a few years from now, for all we know, the regular checkouts may go away. And it may be pretty hard for you to begin to acquire that skill when you are that much older. And we know that this is going to happen, just as it happened with other things we learned about, right? You all remember this guy, I do. And then we moved to different types of phones. And then the old phones began to disappear. And so, again, it's important to learn how to use the smartphones because pretty soon you will not have the opportunity to use other devices. So, again, you'll never be as young as you are today in the future. And we know this happens with other things we use in our lives that by staying with the newer technology keeps us being able to use that technology because things that we initially learned about will go away. So to summarize, just remember that healthy neurons and healthy heart go hand in hand, and they're related to all the things you've been hearing about: exercise, Mediterranean diet, stress management, so coping well emotionally, learning how to meditate, getting enough sleep, and taking your medical regimen seriously for things like your blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes control, as well as other things, of course, that your physician tells you. Um, and then grow and maintain your cognitive reserve. Maintain the reserve of skills, learn new things, be willing to try new things. Because, like I said, some of the older devices or older ways of doing things may not be there in a few years. And if you want to stay independent and not rely on other people to do it for you, it's important that you learn those things now. Last couple of things I just wanted to mention to you. If any of you have concerns about your cognition, we have a cognitive concerns clinic in our department. It's in the Department of Psychology at the University of Utah. And this is intended really for people who are just worried about their cognition, who are worried that maybe they had a relative who had Alzheimer's disease and now they're worried that they themselves may be developing it. Every time they have difficulty remembering a name or getting a little lost in a new town, they really worry that this is something that's a sign of something more serious rather than normal aging. And if that's happening to you, then this cognitive concerns clinic may be a good place for you to go to. Why is this beneficial? Well, remember I said stress is bad for your brain. And if your cognition is stressing you out too much, then we may just be able to help you. I have to say that more often than not, when people are worried about their cognition, when they get screened in our clinic, they find out that they're just fine. There was really nothing to worry about. And it's a really big relief, and they can go on in their life with much less stress. So that's what this clinic is for. So we just do kind of screening, not very thorough assessment, but screening either in person or virtually via Zoom, so via computer and internet. And I was thinking about, it takes about 2 or 3 hours to go through the screening. We give you feedback, sometimes the same day, sometimes within a week or so. And if there is any concern, then we would give you some resources where to go for more help. I was going to give you guys the link to the clinic, and then I realized that's unnecessarily difficult to keep track of, because if you literally just Google Cognitive Concerns Clinic, just that phrase, our clinic will come up on the internet. And lastly, I just want to tell you just a little bit about the research we do in our laboratory. So as you know, I just told you that, staying above that line of normal aging and normal cognition, within normal cognition, allows you to function independently. And all that is true, But we do know that even healthy older adults with perfectly healthy brains can sometimes have a bad day. And when you have a bad day, you may make mistakes, you get a little confused about things. I know I do. You may forget your meds or make some other mistakes. You may trip and fall. And the question is, if you're healthy, then how do you keep yourself functioning independently, not making serious mistakes like, for example, serious medication mistakes or getting injured um, when you don't have generally any concerns about your functioning? And so what we're particularly interested in our lab is that we want to find out who is vulnerable. Which of those healthy people are vulnerable to having such lapses? We all have them sometimes, but some people have them more often. And also, when do those lapses occur? Under what circumstances? And so what we are finding is that for normal, healthy folks, aging older adults, um, things that contribute to such lapses are things like waking up unrefreshed. When you're feeling tired when you wake up in the morning, it's actually more telling about how you'll be functioning that day than the number of hours you slept. So I know, for example, a lot of people use Fitbit or Apple Watch or other devices to keep track of the hours they spend in bed. Um, but the number of hours is actually a little less telling about how you'll function that day than how you're feeling when you wake up. The other thing, I know, people have different lifestyles. Some people keep very, very busy. Some people keep less busy. But pretty much anybody, if you have a day that is very different from your typical days, that's when you're likely to experience some of these lapses in daily functioning. And lastly, when you are in a situation on any given day where you need to engage in a lot of expressive suppression, so that's that type of coping when you don't let other people know how you're feeling. You don't express how you're feeling. You don't let other people see that maybe you're upset. Uh, Experiencing that type of coping on any given day really changes how your cognition is for the next 24 hours or so. So, for example, what we were seeing is that um, people, um, during the pandemic, people have different beliefs. If whichever side of the pandemic beliefs you are, if you're around people who have the other type of beliefs and they're in your family, you may go to a family dinner and need to really keep yourself from expressing what you believe. And that lack of, or that suppression of how you're feeling is really detrimental to your cognition in the next hours or days. And lastly, what we're finding is that while these factors are kind of on average important for everyone, there are actually some people who have certain cognitive profiles, certain cognitive characteristics for whom these issues are a bigger problem, who are much more likely, much more vulnerable to, for example, make mistakes in their daily functioning if they wake up tired. And so what we want to accomplish with our research is to be able to identify people who are at risk and let them know so that they can then kind of adjust what they do on any given day based on how much at risk they are for making a mistake. So if you're interested in our research and in participating, you can email us at neuropsychologylab@gmail.com. I think I'll be able to share these slides with you. I imagine they can be distributed to you guys if you're interested. We also have a phone number. That's a less good way of reaching out to us, because right now during the pandemic, people aren't always manning the phones, and it may take a while to reach us this way. And people who participate will, of course, be reimbursed for their time and will also receive feedback on results of brief cognitive testing that we do with all our participants. And on that note, I'll take questions if you have any. And thank you so much for your attention.